This episode of The Reality Check is brought to you by HelloFresh. Forget takeout. HelloFresh delivers all the ingredients for delicious, healthy meals anyone can prepare at home in less than 30 minutes. And HelloFresh is giving our Canadian checkers 50% off their first order. Go to hellofresh.ca and use promo code REALITY50 to get 50% off your first order. That's hellofresh.ca, promo code REALITY50. This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for Tuesday, April 25th, 2017, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cubachinos?
Christina Roach.
Hello.
And producer Pat.
Hi, everybody.
We got a great show for you today. Christina is going to look into whether witchcraft is a crime in Canada.
Oh.
And then Adam is going to explore whether there is coffee in a unicorn frappuccino.
Indeed.
I've heard both those words, but not in that context. But first, as you heard us mention on our last episode, and perhaps saw our Facebook or Twitter posts, Pat and Christina were at the March for Science in Toronto, and I was at the Ottawa one. I'll quickly cover what the march was about, ask Pat and Christina for their thoughts, and then share some reflections on my side. From good old Wikipedia, the March for Science, formerly known as the Scientists' March on Washington, was a series of rallies and marches held in Washington, D.C., and more than 600 other cities across the world on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2017. According to organizers, the march is a nonpartisan movement to celebrate science and the role it plays in everyday lives. The goal of the marches and rallies were to emphasize that science upholds the common good and to call for evidence-based policy in the public's best interest. That's obviously a direct quote. Now, the March for Science organizers and supporters say that it should be nonpartisan, but of course it was heavily organized by people who are against Trump and what his administration is doing. Whether you're going to call that nonpartisan or not, that is going to depend on your political leaning. Yeah. The March's website states that an American government that ignores science to pursue ideological agendas endangers the world. That's the general overview of what they were trying to achieve.
Fair.
I'm now going to turn to Pat and Christina and ask them how their March experience was.
I've never taken part in a march or that type of event before, so it was a really cool experience to be among so many like-minded people who support science education and evidence-based policy. Outside of some really witty signs, I was really happy to see so many families and especially young girls so excited about the Science March. I posted a photo that I'm sure you guys saw of one girl who looked about, 8 years old, Pat, do you think?
Maybe.
And she was holding a sign that said Future Scientist. And I posted that, and Amy Poehler's Smart Girls retweeted it with a heart emoticon, so that was cool. Nice. Another cool thing, we ran into Elon. Well, he actually came out to say hi because he lived nearby. He used to be on The Reality Check before I took over his duties. And when we were speaking to him, this woman was standing nearby, and she came up and said, I thought I just heard Christina's voice. Are you Cristina and Pat from The Reality Check? And it ended up actually being Maria, whose segment, Pat, you covered Theory versus Theory just a few weeks ago.
That's so cool.
Yeah, so that was really neat. So we got to meet and chat with her for a while. And so that's pretty much what I gleaned from the march.
I thought it was really well attended. I don't know what the numbers are, but it felt like thousands of people. There was a lot of agendas. Mm-hmm. And so that was, I guess, interesting and maybe a little bit difficult to navigate. So, for example, there was quite a large display about taking down the Pickering nuclear plant. So I think that any large march like that, you're going to get people who have like really diverse kind of agendas. Mm-hmm. Is that all really about science? I'm not sure. But all in all, I thought it was great. Yeah, it was great.
Well, and in truth, I saw very little of that except for that one particular example, me personally.
Well, we have to remember that it was Earth Day as well, right? So
yes.
there were several sort of Earth Day type themes going on.
Certainly.
Yeah.
In Ottawa, they said the numbers are about 600 people. I was in the crowd. It felt several hundred, but I didn't know if it felt that big. It wasn't so much a march. I don't know if you actually marched in Toronto. It was more just people gave a series of talks.
We certainly did.
We did. We
certainly
marched
did march.
2 kilometers.
Oh, so that's kind of more fun than sometimes you get a march and you get a strut going.
for sure.
Well, we're just at Parliament Hill and someone's speaking into a microphone. And as you said, it's Earth Day, so other things are there. And there's almost always people around Parliament Hill pushing their particular cause. So I generally had a good time too. I saw some fantastic signs. I posted some of those. One of my favorite was STEMinist, as in STEM as science technology. And anyway, I thought it was very creative and very well done. That said, one thing about doing a podcast about critical thinking for over 8 years is it's hard to turn it off. Also known as Darren is becoming a cranky old man. So I just wanted to share that I personally have trouble with almost any march or rally, and that's kind of just my personal disposition to these things, because I can't help but think about a nuanced point of view, which isn't appropriate for a march or a rally, no matter what the cause is. It's not the place for like, well, but what about this? And let's think about that other side of things. That's not really what we're there for. Also, a bit of a different context for our American listeners, for the Canadian experience, because Trump is really coming out seemingly with an anti-science agenda, especially with the EPA and going against climate change. And we had some issues previously with our government, but the recent government seems to be very pro-science, very concerned about climate change. So it's less of a rally of we really need science more in our government. More it's like, yeah, well, we need science in the world and make sure the government keeps using science, sort of.
And the lesson there is to get science policy, vote for someone who encourages science policy.
Well, yes, exactly. Imagine that. There is actually a causal relationship sometimes.
Yeah.
I had a few general thoughts and themes. The first of which is wondering whether these organized protest rallies, marches were actually a good thing or not. On the face of it, it seems useful. But somehow these acts can become politicized even more than it's possible it could make it worse. It's like an inconvenient truth is what I was thinking. So inconvenient truth became very linked to Al Gore, very linked to climate change, and now climate change is a divisive political issue in the States. Like, there's not any really good reason for that. Conservatives, in theory, want to conserve nature, so why did that happen? You never quite know the consequences of certain actions, even through good intentions. I also think the point of most demonstrations is for solidarity of the attendees instead of actually provoking change. That I don't think people who saw the Ottawa March like, yeah, you know what, now I'm going to use more science and follow this. Like, oh no, people who are there feel good. And that's not a bad thing. I think that's actually very important for movements because there's not that many things that people can get out and join. And skeptics like herding cats, right? Like, we support critical thinking. I'm not coming out, forget it. So sometimes you don't know, and it's important to show that there's a voice, and we can take lessons from the Tea Party movement, right? The second one is, as I mentioned, I try to have this nuanced view of almost any topic, and a rally is not a good place for that, even if I mostly agree with what's being said. That's just a disconnect between what I'm hearing and what I want expressed. Again, there's a series of talks, right? If one is trying to unify people, of course, and I understand this, by definition, it is wise to focus on what people agree about instead of what they disagree about, right? If a large group agrees on 95% of something, and that thing itself seems to be under threat, then it makes little sense to focus on what tears you apart, and it makes sense to focus on what you can unify to defend this against attack. So divisiveness is not wise to explore such a time. That said, I have trouble turning off any sort of critical thinking, and as I said, at my rally there was talks, so there was an Indigenous woman giving a presentation, and no problems given, diversity of speech and whatnot, but I think about 20% of the things she said probably weren't true.
Wow.
Now, there's a certain worldview difference of Mother Earth, whatnot, which you can just chalk up that's different. But a couple other things, I'm like, I don't know if that's true. And I felt almost like fact-checking. I looked at stuff on the internet while she was speaking. I'm like, well, that's kind of true, but that seems like it's fear-mongering. I'm like, do I have to fact-check things at a science march? Come on. So I kind of was annoyed by that. People had signs that said citation needed. I'm like, but here, that's annoying. So even at a pro-science rally, I couldn't help but think of the problems associated with science. So a lot of people think science is good, and they talk about the importance of understanding what climate scientists say about the Earth's climate, but they don't necessarily say, oh, and by the way, of course, science helped create the problem. Science can be neutral, but without science or discoveries in the broad sense, which is what people often interpret science to be, you wouldn't get the Industrial Revolution and technology and the problem of climate change. So yes, there were great signs that said, I didn't die of an infection. Thanks, science. And thanks for the nukes also. So it's just, you typically don't think about that. And not to say you should at a science rally, because you focus on the positive, but I can't help but think right, when someone's saying we need, science to solve the world's problems, and I'm like, created by science.
Yeah.
There's a bit of that. One example is that a woman had a sign with a polar bear on an ice floe surrounded by water, and it said, science, we all depend on it. You're like, well, right, but the polar bear might not have any problems if we didn't have the Industrial Revolution, which is partly due to scientific discovery.
Polar bear needs an air conditioner.
There we go. And then the other thing is that to what extent people understand that science should influence policy or be a factor in policy, but not necessarily determine policy. I think a lot of pro-science people, because they think science should just evidence-based decisions. When you're like, well, there's other factors at play. That if you're a politician, here's some evidence, and those people are going to lose their jobs based on some evidence. You're like, well, now what? There's values and there's different interests, and that's how the world of politics goes. So I think there's also a more nuanced view of just how the world really works and what people care about, and science is important, but it almost has to be one factor among many that any governing party has to decide upon. Not to say what Trump is doing is good, and I think it's generally terrible. And finally, this is where it, again, doesn't make sense to focus on splitting, but I'm pretty sure if we started to explore the crowd of who has supernatural beliefs, who believes in astrology, who believes in all these things, you'd have a huge problem. And even with, say, the importance of the science of climate change, like, well, should we be using more science, like geoengineering, which is now called climate science, to help the problem? You see people like, no. Like, so you're at a pro-science rally and you're against science? Well, that kind of science. And then similarly, some people are against GMOs and some people are for nuclear. And you said the Pickering plant in Toronto. So this is where at the show we at least try to promote the methodology of science, the way of thinking. And that's why the post I made on Facebook was about evidence and logic and cognitive humility. And I wish that is what we could rally around, because that is easy for me to rally around. I don't need to put too many asterisks along with that. So if you have that as the method, then it's easy to support, and then that should flow and dictate everything else. Get back to promoting good ideas of evidence and clear thinking, we're going to explore witchcraft and whether it's a crime in Canada. Cristina, take it away.
So I was minding my own business a couple of weeks ago when I came across the following headline. Toronto man charged with witchcraft in alleged $101,000 fraud. Now, admittedly, I thought this may be an Onion article at first glance, but the sources publishing the story were all pretty legit news outlets. So here's the gist. A Toronto-based man who calls himself Master Ragov advertised his astrological center, where his services included astrology and psychic readings. His ad also advertised the removal of black magic evil spirits and promised to solve all your most pressing problems, from love to money and court problems. Don't worry, there is a 100% guarantee. Ragov, whose real name is Murali Mathialu, apparently convinced the victim in this case that his daughter was sick due to an evil spirit that he could help remove. The victim's daughter's health remained unchanged, so of course, more rituals were suggested as being necessary. And with every ritual, Mathialu's prices increased each time. By the time the victim realized something may be amiss, he was $101,000 out of pocket. He finally called the police with the suspicion of fraud, and Mathialu was charged with witchcraft, extortion, and fraud just last month. So you may ask, how the heck is witchcraft a crime in Canada in 2017, which is what I asked myself. But checkers, it's actually the act of pretending to practice witchcraft, which is indeed a crime.
Oh, good on you, Canada. Pot's coming in and practicing witchcraft is illegal.
Mm-hmm. Joshua Clark, a criminal defense attorney out of Ottawa, breaks down the law in his blog, which I link to. Witchcraft is dealt with in Section 365 of the Canadian Criminal Code and is one of a group of 5 offenses which deals with false pretenses. It states that you're guilty of a summary offense, or in other words, a minor crime, if you fraudulently do any of the following. 1. Pretend to exercise or to use any kind of witchcraft, sorcery, enchantment, or conjuration. 2. Undertake for a consideration to tell fortunes. And 3. Pretend from one's skill in or knowledge of an occult or crafty science to discover where or in what manner anything that is supposed to have been stolen or lost may be found.
I'm sure you're going to get to this, but fraudulently and pretend, as opposed to there's an alternative.
Yes.
Okay. And there's crafty science. Was that what it said?
Yeah, crafty.
It's like an
code.
Etsy store for scientists or something.
Yes, I'll get to that.
I'm sure you will.
So I just want to highlight the line that prohibits undertaking for a consideration to tell fortunes first. This would technically ban people who advertise as professional psychics, astrologers, and tarot card readers, but you'll note the use of the word pretends.
Right.
Believe it or not, it is possible for accused soothsayers to avoid a fraud conviction if that person charged testifying that they genuinely believe they possess these abilities.
Oh, I thought it was going to go the other way. That's interesting.
That's sad.
Law Now magazine states in a 2011 issue, quote, "The offense is only committed if the practice is undertaken fraudulently, which the law usually defines as involving the intentional and dishonest putting of another person's interests at risk." So let me define false pretenses in section 361. A false pretense is a representation of a matter of fact, either present or past, made by words or otherwise, that is known by the person who makes it to be false, and that is made with a fraudulent intent to induce the person to whom it is made to act on it. Exaggerated commendation or depreciation of the quality of anything is not a false pretense unless it is carried to such an extent that it amounts to a fraudulent misrepresentation of fact. Okay, so let's just break this down, guys, shall we? There is a Canada-wide law that it is illegal to pretend to practice witchcraft or sorcery. So it's kind of like our government is acknowledging that sorcery legit exists, but you can't pretend to practice it or you'll get up to a maximum 6 months in prison. What the F, Canada? Now, let's talk about Section 365 of the Criminal Code for a moment to help put things into perspective. Section 365 is often cited as the textbook example of an archaic law. As the National Post outlines, Section 365 is a distant descendant of medieval English laws that sentenced accused witches to burn at the stake. In 1735, King George II amended the law in an effort to discourage potential fraudsters, and this came long after most Brits had stopped believing in sorcery. Then, more than a century later, Canadian legal framers, aka drafters of legislation, decided it somehow made sense to include it in the inaugural 1892 edition of the Criminal Code of Canada, where it remains to this day alongside other antiquated and rarely used sections in Canadian law, such as anti-dueling, and, I love this one, alarming the Queen. Interesting side note, I read that Canada's inclusion of the law may have stemmed from a desire to control the gypsy populations, according to a 1999 criminology thesis by Tracandra MacDonald from the University of Ottawa. Okay, but how often is this ever enforced? Is it enforceable? This is the first time I remember hearing about someone in our local news being charged with witchcraft, but it's only because I seem to be paying more attention. Although it's one of the more archaic offenses in the criminal code and prosecutions are rare, a handful of Canadians have been charged under Section 365 in recent years. In 2014, an occultist based in Quebec City known as Professor Alfseny was accused of falsely claiming to be a medium and charged under Section 365 for pretending to practice witchcraft, and he was also charged with fraud, which separately carries a conviction of up to 14 years in prison. He'd advertised his services in newspapers and online as, quote, "Great clairvoyant medium, solves your problems, return of the beloved, luck, gambling, protection, etc., guaranteed results." And one of his victims was bilked of over $5,000. In 2012, a Spanish-language newspaper publisher was charged under the same Section 365 after convincing a 56-year-old Toronto woman that he could lift her family's curse for the low price of $14,000. In 2010, a Brampton man, which is a town just outside of Toronto, was charged after taking money for performing witchcraft-related services at his home over the course of a year. Police said he was advertising that he had the ability to use magic to solve his victims' various problems. And in 2009, a Toronto woman was charged after taking $27,000 from a grieving Toronto lawyer. Seems to be a theme, eh? People who've lost people, grieving, people who are weak.
Of course.
After alleging that she was possessed by the spirit of his dead sister. This woman claimed to come from a long line of witches and that his sister's spirit had returned in feminine form, coincidentally hers, and somehow channeling that would guide him to financial prosperity and business success. By the way, she pleaded guilty to 4 counts of fraud, but the Crown withdrew the witchcraft charge. And that brings me to another point. If your chances of being charged with witchcraft are slim, a conviction under Section 365 is even more slim. Legal scholars point out that charges can also be challenged when they bump up against freedom of conscience and religion rights guaranteed under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Sergeant Randy Fincham, a Vancouver police spokesperson who's witnessed his share of similar shenanigans, told the National Post, prosecutors would have to be able to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the bad guy doesn't actually have these powers. And I don't even know how you'd go about proving that. Calgary lawyer Lisa Silver told the Post the criminal code needs to be rewritten, arguing that it is, quote, confusing, poorly structured, and full of sections that reflect outdated science or morality. As an example, guys, one section that makes it illegal to print, publish, distribute, or sell comics depicting crime is still in the criminal code.
Wow.
And that law was used in 1953 to convict a Manitoba comic book vendor for selling a, quote, crime comic, specifically a Dick Tracy comic book.
Crime comic.
Totally thought it was going to be Batman. He's a jerk.
And Silver points out a larger problem. Section 19 of the Criminal Code states that ignorance of the law by a person who commits an offense is not an excuse for committing that offense. Says Silver, every one of us, all the citizens in Canada, have to know what behavior is appropriate and not appropriate under the law. And how can we do that? How can we articulate that if we don't have a criminal code that speaks to us now? So one last side note, many fraudsters try to circumvent this law by operating overseas and advertising in forums like eBay. But interestingly, in 2012, fear of fraudulent sorcerers prompted eBay to drop any sellers that offered, quote, spells, curses, hexing, conjuring, magic, prayers, blessing service, healing sessions, and other metaphysical readings and services. But guys, what's the harm, right? Well,
Certainly people seem to be losing money, and we don't actually have time to fully explore this, but I find this very interesting, this intersection of law and belief, and I guess appropriate skepticism, right, in people possibly losing some money. Because it's one thing to try to figure out how you might test whether someone has these magical powers, but I think it's more, do they actually sincerely believe it? And that's where it gets tricky, because currently we do have freedom of conscience and expression, so you're allowed to believe in any religion you want, and you can sincerely have that belief, and I'm sure you can engage in relationships, even going to a church where you're paying money, and someone's saying this is going to get you salvation, and that's legitimated. So I find that very interesting as well. Imagine you're a person who believes they are cursed. Who are you going to talk to? Right. You believe you're cursed? The government now won't let someone help you?
You're allowed to talk to someone who believes they can cure you.
Well, you are allowed. Exactly. In theory, you're allowed to pay them money. It just, whether you feel that they got a bad service, I guess. Turns out I still have the curse because this guy didn't do a good enough job. That's interesting.
It just seems very impractical to try to legislate sincerity and belief instead of just saying you just can't do this thing. Like, it would be easy for them to say you can't claim to be psychic. Like, you can't charge people for psychic services because they're not real. Like, it would be easy to say that. And then people could get angry about it, and that's fine. And they can be wrong, and that's fine. But I think people wouldn't really go along with that. It goes against, like, sort of ideas people have about freedom.
It's about as real as unicorns. And their frappuccinos, which may or may not include coffee. Adam, what's the deal?
Great question, Darren. Just what is a frappuccino? This wasn't something I ever put much thought into until the recent craze about the Starbucks Unicorn Frappuccino. It made me question my fundamental assumptions about reality. The Unicorn Frappuccino is a limited edition drink that was available at Starbucks coffee shops from April 19th to the 23rd. Apparently having it be available on April 20th was not a great idea. It's a multicolored whipped cream looking monstrosity that was so popular that many Starbucks locations ran out of its base ingredients and couldn't keep up with demand. How sad. I don't drink coffee, and due to my colitis, I don't drink milk or cream. So a unicorn frappuccino was not high on my priorities, but my fiancée wanted to try one out, so we took a little trip to the closest Starbucks. She noticed something odd about the frappuccino. It didn't taste like it had any coffee in it. I took a taste and didn't notice any myself, instead tasting milk, mango, and a whole bunch of sugar. My buddy Tom is a barista, or whatever they call him at Starbucks, and he confirmed that this drink has no coffee. A look at the Starbucks website confirmed that there was indeed no coffee in the ingredients list. Huh? What's this all about? I wondered, what is a frappuccino exactly?
Oh, there's so many listeners flipping tables right now.
I don't know what it is either, by the way.
So doesn't chino mean coffee or something? I don't know. I had to look it up. It turns out that Frappuccino, as a term, is a trademark of Starbucks, though it was not originally a Starbucks drink. No, wait, I'll explain. I know you all want to know. The term was originally devised as a portmanteau of frappe and cappuccino. Frappe is a French word meaning beat or hit. In this case, it means a sort of thick milkshake. Cappuccino is indeed a sort of coffee. This is a double espresso with steamed milk foam. This is smaller than a latte, which is coffee with milk foam on top. Espresso is just basically concentrated coffee. Okay, so the origin of the word frappuccino comes from cappuccino, which does mean a kind of coffee. The term was itself used in the Boston area of Massachusetts as a coffee shop chain, The Coffee Connection, first used it. Starbucks purchased The Coffee Connection in 1994, gaining exclusive rights to the term. It then introduced the Frappuccino using a different recipe than The Coffee Connection had. The Frappuccino comes in a wide variety of flavors, including many that actually have no coffee. The Coffee Frappuccino that they have is the original drink from 1995, which has coffee in it. A number of variations with coffee exist, including mocha, espresso, and caramel, but a number of blended cream and blended juice options also exist, and those don't include actual coffee. So, it really is a copyrighted term which Starbucks can do whatever they want with. You aren't going to find a Frappuccino elsewhere, but other competitors make similar products under other names. The frappe coffee, an inspiration for the name, is a different kind of popular Greek drink. Dunkin' Donuts serves an iced latte. Cinnabon has a mocha latte and caramel latte, similar to the mocha and caramel variants in Starbucks. Tim Hortons has an iced cap, which is a slushy type drink with milk and coffee flavor. Slush Puppy Canada has their own iced cappuccino product. As for variants without coffee, well, Dairy Queen or any milkshake place is going to have something that's going to be like a Frappuccino without coffee. The complete real name of the drink is the Unicorn Frappuccino Blended Cream. But cream is spelled C-R-E-M-E with an accent on the first E, and that is the French word for cream. So what does this even mean? I often see cream misspelled in some way on foods, either to try to give it an international appeal or to avoid drawing attention to the fact that it doesn't contain actual cream. I see this on cookies a lot. So in Canada, there are a lot of restrictions on what things can be called. Hence, products often billed as soy milk in other countries will be billed as soy beverage or something similar here in Canada and other countries where they have similar restrictions. This has to do with our dairy industry. This didn't seem to be the issue for the Starbucks Unicorn Frappuccino, however. The drink name originates in the United States, and it does contain actual whipped cream, which is cream, so that's fine. The French-sounding name, like the Italian sizes for their drinks, are likely simply meant to add a pretentious foreign sound to the word. Okay, so they have no coffee, but they have cream. But why is it called the unicorn? A unicorn is a mythical creature, a horse with a single horn, known for its magical properties. The website describes a magical flavor, and that it has sprinkled pink and blue fairy powders. They were very sour powders. With a little digging, I found references to unicorn food above and beyond this actual drink. The Unicorn Foods Wikipedia page, however, was created on April 19th, the first day the Unicorn Frappuccino was for sale. It's marked for deletion and contains only one sentence. Unicorn food is a style of food presentation that utilizes a rainbow color palette to decorate foods. The image on the page is of Starbucks Unicorn Frappuccino. Now, references refer to coffee shops in Williamsburg and such places with highly colorful yet extremely healthy foods, which are being referred to as unicorn food. It's all said to have started with a natural food diet by a health and wellness blogger. Now, the Starbucks processed Frappuccino doesn't really fit with these, but these silly things take on a life of their own. Since the Unicorn Frappuccino is so much more popular than any of these other unicorn foods, it seems likely that any unicorn foods in the future will probably have more to do with the Starbucks food than these original foods that would have been around. The Starbucks Unicorn Frappuccino doesn't contain coffee, and since the word Frappuccino is owned by Starbucks, it can mean whatever they want it to mean, whether it sounds like it should have coffee in it or not.
I bet a lot of people will be surprised that there's no coffee in a Frappuccino. Which is, by the way, isn't that a combination of a French and an Italian word? Cappuccino, isn't that derivative of Italian? Or?
I assume so.
Yeah, I guess it is. I guess it is. You can mix all kinds of words. So the full name is just a combination of so many different languages and mixed words and whatever. But, they can do what they want.
Thanks, Adam. And thanks for joining us once again, listeners. We talked about the March for Science and how rallies are great, and it's best not to have nuanced views at a rally, but there are important things to consider when you're not at the rally about the nature of science and what its role is in the world. Cristina explored the practicing of witchcraft in Canada, and it's illegal as long as you're practicing in a pretend manner, but not necessarily if you have a sincere belief. But stop defrauding people. And if people think they're cursed, I don't know, give them a hug or something and ask them about their life. And finally, Adam talked to us about Frappuccinos and how some of them contain coffee, but the unicorn one does not. Like the mythical unicorn itself, it just doesn't exist. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids. Stay
classy, not smart-assy.
Good night, everyone.
I mean, an actual unicorn could contain coffee if you drank coffee.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
Adam,
you said
one
is
of
which. It's Darren.
which?
One is which.
Oh, sorry, Darren.
I'm Adam. Hi.
Pat, don't fact check Cristina in the middle of her fact checking me, all right? You want a better one than that?
Yeah, Pat just literally did a thumbs down. He was just about to.
All right. Regardless of which science march you went to, we can all agree it's good to be crafty. And by that I mean, no.
Sorry. Unicorn Frappuccino doesn't, but some Frappuccinos do have coffee.
Right.
I don't know if you want to.
So yeah, I'll take it again. I'll take it. Sorry, no, that's important.
Get it
it's important.
right, Darren. People are going to write in, Darren.